In this video, we're going to review comments of several well-known scholars about the relationship between the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts of the Apostles. We're going to see that scholars recognize that both Luke and Acts were originally composed as two parts of a single work. It was a two-volume composition by the author Luke, who intended both books to remain together. However, quite early on, the Gospel of Luke was grouped with the other three Gospels, and the book of Acts was separated from Luke. In the usual layout today, the Gospel of John intervenes between Luke and Acts. I am convinced that this division was unintended by the author Luke, and it has had a detrimental effect, particularly on discerning baptism in the New Testament. We will review comments of the following scholars: Howard Marshall, Richard Longenecker, F. Bruce, Eckhard Schnabel, and Darrell Bock. After that, we will consider the translation of James 2, verse 2, and we will present the possibility that there is a widespread attitude that downplays the importance of biblical evidence of the Jewish origin of the good news. So the first scholar we're going to look at is Howard Marshall in the Tyndale New Testament commentaries, Howard Marshall being a well-known scholar, and we're going to look at a comment that he made about the book of Acts and how we're to relate to the book of Acts in relationship to the Gospel of Luke. So here it is. The second point is that the book of Acts is the second part of a two-volume work whose first part is the Gospel of Luke. It is one of the unfortunate effects of the present ordering of the books of the New Testament that it leads us to think of Acts as a separate work on its own. But it was common in the ancient world for a writer to organize a work into several shorter sections known as books and to furnish each with its own brief introduction. Luke's contemporary Josephus the Jewish historian, wrote an apology for the Jews divided into two books, the second of which begins thus: "In the first volume of this work, my esteemed Epaphroditus, I demonstrated the antiquity of our race, and I also challenged the statements of Manetho, Chaeremon, and some others. I shall now proceed to refute the rest of the authors who have attacked us." This extract is interesting for the way in which it parallels the details of Luke's own introduction to his work. But our present point is that it underlines the fact that Acts and the Gospel form the two parts of one single work. It follows that to ask questions about the purpose of Acts in isolation from the broader question of the purpose of Luke Acts is to set off from the wrong starting point, a practice which generally leads to arrival at the wrong destination. So it emerges that we must ask about the purpose of Luke Acts as a whole. And this, folks, includes the topic of baptism. If we're going to talk about Luke, then we have to talk about Luke Acts. If we're going to talk about Acts, for example, Acts 2:38, then we have to include Luke. We have to start from Luke. So when we think about Acts 2:38 and Peter's command to the worshipers in Jerusalem on the day of Shavuot or Pentecost, then we have to be thinking about what's in the Gospel of Luke, not in other sources like the Gospel of Matthew. So that's what we're going to be looking at during our study of Luke Acts. And now we're going to look at the comments of another scholar. This is in the Expositor's Bible Commentary, and we're going to be looking at the book of Acts, Richard N. Longenecker. The Acts of the Apostles. So, we start. The Acts of the Apostles is the name given to the second part of a 2-volume work, traditionally identified as having been written by Luke, a companion of the Apostle Paul. Originally, the 2 volumes circulated together as 2 parts of one complete writing. But during the late 1st or early 2nd century, the first volume became associated with the Gospels identified with Matthew, Mark, and John, thus forming the 4-fold Gospel. Luke's 2nd volume, which is Acts, Luke's 2nd volume was left to go its own way. Down here, Acts is the 3rd longest of the New Testament writings, being about 1/10 shorter than its companion volume, Luke, the longest New Testament book. In other words, Luke is the longest New Testament book. And Acts is almost exactly the length of Matthew. Together, Luke Acts comprises almost 30% of the material in the New Testament, exceeding both the Pauline and the Johannine writings in size. In other words, Luke Acts by themselves are larger than all of Paul's material, and they are larger than all of John's material. Paul's material, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Luke Acts is greater in size than everything that Paul wrote, and it's greater in size than everything that John wrote. John wrote the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and included is the book of Revelation. So Luke Acts is larger than what Paul wrote or what John wrote. And it's about 30% of the material in the New Testament. So we're going to be studying Luke Acts as the backbone of our investigation into what baptism meant for the early believers. We're going to look at another authority here, F.F. Bruce, very well known among conservatives and evangelicals. We're going to look at a few comments that he makes about Acts, just going to add to our certainty that we have to look at Acts from the perspective of Luke. We cannot start applying other scriptures onto the book of Acts out of our own whims. So this is what F.F. Bruce says about Luke Acts. Originally, as we might expect, these 2 volumes circulated together as one complete and independent history, but not for long. In the early 2nd century, the 4 canonical Gospels, as we call them, were gathered together into one collection and began to circulate as the 4-fold Gospel. This meant that the earlier volume of our twofold history being Luke Acts, the earlier volume, Luke, was detached from its sequel, Acts, and attached to 3 works by other writers which covered more or less the same ground, relating the story of Jesus and ending with the witness to his resurrection. The 2nd volume, Acts, was thus left to pursue a career of its own, but an important and influential career as it proved.